Hello and welcome to Palestine Deep Dive. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Ramzy Baroud, a renowned Palestinian intellectual, historian, and a journalist, and an author of many, many books. He is also the editor of Palestine Chronicle. Dr. Ramzy and I known each other for many years, maybe 10 years, Dr. Ramzy.
I
And
would say so, yes.
yeah, and this time we speak after 9 months of genocide into Gaza, 9 months of genocide into Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have been killed, tens of thousands of people have been injured, and the world seems to care less about Palestine. And to be honest, we've met Dr. Ramzi a few weeks ago, and I explained to you how I am in a difficult time of my life. I feel hopeless. The situation seems very bleak, and especially after Ramzi, if I want to be honest with you, after the standing ovation I saw in the Congress last week, I couldn't get over this. I couldn't get over this. The Congress, the US, invited a war criminal, someone who has killed tens of thousands of Palestinian children and women and innocent people. He has destroyed Gaza, and still they invited him. They gave him more than 50 standing ovations. He was celebrated as a hero in the US. And this actually tells me that the US is no longer this mediator for peace in Israel and Palestine. It proved itself once again that it is not neutral. It is very, very biased. Sometimes it feels that we, the Palestinians, were not being fought, were not being killed by Israel, but also in the US. But at the same time, we feel that there are some changes that happen in the region. For example, today or last night, maybe 2 days ago, Erdogan said something very different. He said that it is not impossible that Turkey can get involved militarily in Israel Palestine. This is something new that happened to the conflict, and we also saw this missile that killed 12 Israeli children in the Golan Heights. But at the same time, what's notable is that China hosted the Palestinian factions in Beijing. 14 Palestinian factions uh, they met in Beijing and they signed the Declaration of Beijing, to which they agreed that there will be reconciliation. And you and I know that declarations like this happened many, many times before. Not that we believe that a reconciliation will happen eventually in Palestine, but this is the first time that China hosts Palestinian factions and intervene in the geopolitics. Can you, in the geopolitics of the Middle East, can you please, before we start, tell us a little bit about this agreement that included Fatah and Hamas? Give me more information about this, please, if you may.
Right. First of all, thank you very much, Ahmed, and for the fantastic work you've been doing. And Palestine Deep Dive, really, you have been such a massive boost to independent media on Palestine and, frankly, everywhere else, for that matter. And you have been critical in the views of many, many people around the world because of the amazing work you've been doing. So kudos to all of you
Thank you.
for all of your work. The situation, the relationship between China and the Middle East is quite interesting. We have to look back at history just a little bit to kind of place it within a different context than the current politicking underway in the region. China historically has been a, a strong supporter of many Middle Eastern, particularly Arab countries, in the face of Israel. I mean, China has always been a friend of the Arabs. And that is kind of the pre Soviet Union's kind of the collapse of the Soviet Union's formation of the geopolitics of the region. We've always known that the Soviets have stood by the Arabs, the United States stood by Israel. China played a supportive role of the Soviets, but it was always viewed in positive light as far as Arab governments are concerned. But also, China hasn't really deeply got involved in the intricacies of Middle East politics. So it's kind of try to find this middle ground, not middle ground between the Arabs and Israel, but middle ground between China's global policies and its what is required of China to be pro-Arabs or pro-Palestine. And that, as a result, did have a major influence on the collective mindset of the Chinese people. I visited China before, and I've met various stratas of Chinese societies, including, of course, politicians and members of the Communist Party, but also ordinary people and throughout the country. And the result was it seems that China remains at its core or sees itself as a country that is within the Arab camp. But here is the problem. Several things happened in China itself, the changes that happened in Chinese society following the industrialization and the opening up of the economy, trying to find some sort of a balance between China's ambitions in Asia and beyond and its need to be part of the Western dominated markets in Europe and in the Middle East, especially during the period of Deng Xiaoping and others. That legacy continued until the Oslo Agreement took place. Many people are under the impression, or when they engage in conversations about Oslo, they miss a very important part of that conversation. Oslo wasn't about was it really the right thing for Palestinians to do or not. They lost more land than they actually, and they must lost most more land than the settlements tripled, the settlers tripled, and they gained nothing, none of their national rights and that sort of thing. But what we don't usually talk about is the psychology of Oslo, the impact of Oslo at the international solidarity that has been taking place with um, in the relationship between Palestine and the global south, China, Russia, and other countries. And I've also been to many countries in Africa, and that was kind of pretty much the answer I got when I asked various representatives of governments or political parties to please, boycott Israel, do not fall into the trap of normalization. And the answer was always, but if you Palestinians are normalizing, why shouldn't we? If you Palestinian, in fact, your own ambassador in our country said, we are okay with you normalizing with Israel, why shouldn't we? Now, why should China be the exception? China is always reprimanded or often reprimanded for extended commercial ties with Israel, trying to have access to Israeli ports, mainly Haifa port, being involved in the some in the technological exchanges with Israel, being reliant on Israeli technologies in some areas because they want Israel to be part of the Road and Belt Initiative. But on the other hand, we forget that there is no pressure on China. China has no leverage anymore. There is nothing to gain out of being as a strong backer and support of the Palestinians because the Arabs are not making any demands on China and the Palestinians are putting very little demands on China. So China doesn't feel that from a geopolitical point of view it really needs to play that role
Mm.
anymore, right? But something has changed, and I wouldn't even say since the start of the Gaza war. I think the Gaza war, and we can talk about it, but I don't think the change started with the Israeli genocide in the Gaza Strip. I think the change happened prior to that when the United States has given various ultimatums to Israel that you have a certain threshold, a certain limit that you cannot pass as far as your relationship with China is concerned. And obviously, Israel had to make the decision of remaining a strong ally with Israel, with the United States, than with China when the Chinese position kind of coalesced into a stronger role in favor of Russia and its war against Ukraine, but also by extension NATO and the rest of Western countries. Also, Israel found that it had no alternative but inch closer to the American position. So there was a thawing in relationship between China and Israel prior to the war.
Mm.
When the genocide started, let's say when the war started, you know what? I'm going to take you a step closer. Before the war even started, immediately after October 7, even then, while many other countries, including Russia, condemned the Palestinians squarely, the Chinese didn't. They refused to, with the Russian ambassador at the United Nations Security Council, they refused to vote in favor of a resolution that condemned the Palestinian resistance. When the Israeli war turned genocide, the Chinese position became stronger and stronger, and even more emotive, more articulate, to the point that the Chinese ambassador at The Hague, in prior to the consultations regarding the recent ICJ ruling, International Court of Justice ruling on the Israeli occupation of Palestine, it was only the Chinese that actually took the stance that Palestinians have the right to use armed struggle because it is consistent with international law. Arab countries did not dare cross that line. The Chinese did. So it was very clear that the Chinese were evolving in their position using language that's reminiscent of the language used by the Chinese Communist Party at the height of the relations between the PLO and Beijing. So now we are seeing China coming back to that strong position, and that's, in my opinion, the proper context
I would
to
like to ask you
the
many
Beijing Declaration.
thank you very much. Would like to ask you many questions about that actually. But first, let me get back to something that you just mentioned. You said that when you were meeting with some politicians, they said to you that you Palestinians are normalizing with Israel. So why don't we normalize? Is this really accurate? Are we normalizing as Palestinians with Israel? I remember when the UAE normalized with Israel, the PA went mad at them, and they almost wanted to cut the relations with the UAE and Bahrain. So, is it really accurate that we are normalizing or encouraging normalization with Israel?
Not only we actually normalize, not we, our so-called leadership, normalize with Israel, they have normalized Israel, which is even a whole different step of normalization. It's one thing that you start diplomatic ties with a country, you might not see eye to eye on so many things. For example, the Iranians and the Saudis normalize their diplomatic ties. It doesn't mean that they are madly in love or they are, there's this perfect alliance in their foreign policy. But it's one thing for Iran to become an advocate of Saudi policies worldwide. That's a whole different level of normalization. And there's nothing to hide here anymore. But at one point in South Africa during a trip, I went to speak with the Prime Minister of the Western Cape of South Africa, and two things that, I was talking about the siege, and you need to do more to put pressure so that the government would champion an anti-siege policy and get Africa to help in the breaking the siege, through their strong networking in the United Nations. And he said, "This is very interesting what you are telling me, Ramzy, because I have met with representatives of Hamas and representatives of Fatah, and they said nothing about the siege. Neither group said anything about the siege. Hamas said, we have won the elections, the democratic elections, fair and square, and we are the new representatives of the Palestinians. While Fatah came to lobby with me that you should, under any circumstance, legitimize Hamas, and only Fatah and the Palestinian Authority are the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people." In other words, the priorities are entirely different.
Mm,
You as an activist, I as an activist, groups all over the world, Palestinians themselves. Why should we even talk about groups around the world? The Palestinians themselves in Gaza and elsewhere, Jenin, Tulkarem, Hebron, and elsewhere, they're saying this is the priority. The priority is ending the Israeli occupation, the apartheid regime, and so much more, and the siege, and now the genocide. Well, it seems to me that those who claim to represent Palestinians worldwide are really more fixated on being seen as the valid and the proper and the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So the whole idea of normalization as seen through the media, in my opinion, is wrong.
mm,
You are against normalization because you don't want Palestinians to lose another line of defense. You want international pressure to remain on Israel until it relents and it ends its military occupation. But there are those within the Palestinian leadership who are against the normalization for the wrong reasons. They don't want normalization because they do not want to be superseded or marginalized in the political process. We remember what Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the former American president and possibly the next president of the United States, Donald Trump, when he made that statement that Palestinians can either put up or shut up. Palestinians are not important. We throw some money on the Palestinians and they would accept. And that's precisely what happened. They were very angry at the United Arab Emirates. They were angry at other Arab countries. But eventually, the ambassadors came back. The money continued coming in and so forth. So it's not normalization for they don't dislike or attack normalization for the same reasons that they should, but rather for self-serving reasons. And that's why, back to the China situation, it would have been ridiculous. And I'm being really honest here, Ahmed.
Mm.
It would have been ridiculous to expect whether China or, I don't know, Kenya to take a stance against Israel and to be at the forefront of Palestinian solidarity, while those who represent our people supposedly seem to be driven by other priorities. And this is why I think what South Africa, but also Colombia, and of course Venezuela, and other countries in the global south, but also countries like Namibia and others, what they have done and said and the actions that they have taken since the start of the genocide, in a way it is absolutely inspiring. I mean, I do get depressed. I mean, when you see the body bags every day on television from Nasser hospital to elsewhere in Gaza, I mean, it's very difficult to remain optimistic and positive and buoyant about it all. But really, when you think about it, what these countries have done, despite the fact that we do not have the kind of radical leadership that should speak the kind of radical language that is consistent with the fact that our people are being finished off in Gaza, these countries challenged the rules of politics and took stances that, in some extents, are actually much stronger than the stances taken by our supposed natural allies and strategic depth in the Middle East.
But what is the geopolitical significance of China taking these steps and it changing its politics towards Palestine? Is there any significance at all?
Brilliant
Or maybe,
question. Yes,
maybe I should ask you another question about that. Does China really take these steps out of moral stance, or just they want to oppose America?
bravo. Yeah, yeah. First of all, it is significant because in geopolitics, um, what everyone vies to achieve in a geopolitical struggle, and we are living in the, I would say, the greatest geopolitical struggle since World War II. What every member, every country, every state actor, frankly, even non-state actors like Hezbollah and Ansarullah, what they try to achieve is leverage. They want to have enough leverage that would allow them to bargain a better status. So, for example, if Ansarullah were at the bottom of the food chain as far as geopolitics is concerned, they are somewhere up here. So the Chinese are talking to them, the Americans try to talk to them in Oman, secret meetings that American media revealed, and so forth. These are a group of people who have been completely marginalized, irrelevant, immaterial, and important to anybody. Suddenly, they hold meetings with the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans. What do you want from me? What can I give you? What can you give me? But they remained steadfast in support of the Palestinians. They haven't changed that position, and that's where the element of morality comes in. I am not a romantic. I do believe that in politics, nothing nothing trumps interest. It's always on top of everything. But there is an element of morality. And I think morality in these kind of experiences comes from mutual experiences, collective experiences throughout the years. This is why Russia is having such an easy time delving back into Africa, because not because they are offering billions and billions of dollars of developments, the Chinese do, by the way, but because many African countries, when they look into their past, they always think of the warm relationship they had with the Soviets. And because the Soviets were part of various struggles for liberation and anti colonial struggles throughout the continent. So, call this morality, call it something else, but there is another component aside from money, firepower, material, tangible things. So what helps in the relationship between the Chinese and the Palestinians? There's a mutual trust that took place over the course of many years. That's number one. But the other thing is that Palestinians in the post collapse of Soviet Union stage been orphaned.
Mm.
They have been orphaned from a geopolitical perspective. I'm not providing any justification, neither to the PLO, to the Palestinian Authority, or to anybody else. But in reality, they have been orphaned. They had strategic depth. The strategic depth was these countries like the Soviets and the Chinese and others, and even India at one point, right? And they also had the strategic depth in the Middle East first and Africa second. Like, for example, the African, the law that passed in the 1970s at the United Nations equating Zionism with racism was itself a kind of a rewritten version of another law that passed by the African Union, or the former body of the African Union, that also made the same realization that the regime in Pretoria and Tel Aviv are racist apartheid regimes. It was the Africans who actually molded that language with the Arabs. They lobbied at the General Assembly and they passed a law that says Zionism is racism. That is how strategic depth works in politics. But later on, of course, we lost that strategic depth. We are still struggling to keep some African countries actually on our side. Please, Cameroon, do not take Israel's side, or at least remain neutral about the issue. So, because Palestinians have been orphaned, there hasn't been anybody that we could turn to. At the Arab level, Egypt was the big brother. We always looked at Egypt, help us out, right? Egypt went to wars, not just because of Palestine, but also because of Egypt and other priorities. But those big brothers of the Arab world have turned against us. They are actually facilitating the economic survival of Israel at the same time that Palestinians in Gaza are starving to death, right? The strategic depth in Africa and the global south is actually proving to be more relevant to us now than the Arabs,
Mm.
right? Um, but the most important player in all of this is the big countries, those on the very top. The United States first, China, Russia, and others. So the Palestinians have been in a ceaseless search for a new powerful superpower slash ally that would allow them to say, "Hey, the Palestinians is my area of my political domain. Leave the Palestinians alone because this is these are my guys." That sort of thing.
Okay.
The Soviets have done this a lot in the past, but we don't have anybody who come and say hands off the Palestinians because this is a Chinese, area of influence or political domain. The Palestinians naturally should be seeking that kind of alliances, but we haven't. Now the question is, will the Beijing Declaration become, and I think, by the way, this is far more important in my mind, on whether Palestinians reconcile or don't reconcile, is whether the Chinese government and state become the new sponsors of Palestine at the international
That's
arena. And
exactly what I
that's
wanted
a
to
whole.
ask you. That's what I wanted to ask you now. They also wanted to ask you if that actually signal a shift away from the US dominance in the region.
So the US dominance in the region has been in decline for years. I remember when I used to write about this years and years ago, and I used to always be challenged by kind of mainstream writers and readers in the US saying, "Oh, wishful thinking, they have been talking about American decline. Just, this will never happen." Well, here's an example of why it's happening, one out of numerous examples. When the American military leadership says that the challenge faced by the American Navy in the Red Sea because of Ansarullah, a non state actor in a country that until now struggles with famine and cholera,
Mm.
have actually pushed Americans to the point that the American military says that this is the greatest challenge we have faced since World War II. I mean, that by itself could indicate that indeed American influence in the region has changed. Once upon a time, and particularly post 1990, post Soviet, but also post First Iraq War, 1990-91, and post Madrid talks, when they dragged the Palestinians and the Arabs to Madrid and says, okay, let's Let's, start this thing we call the peace process under American auspices. Since then, very few countries, if any, had any real influence contesting the geopolitical map of the Middle East until today. The contest is back on. But what is so shocking and surprising is the contest, and I think this is for historians, to try to justify or explain what happened, is that historically great games are always happening between great powers,
Mm.
not between a fading great power and non-state actors. So you have non-state actors pushing and challenging the American domain in the Middle East, and by extension challenging other countries that have historically linked themselves to this American superpower. So, for example, when the Ansarullah threatened the Saudis over the banking crisis, and the Saudis says, "Listen, what do you want from us? Let's do a new agreement, and we don't want war with the Houthis." And when Hezbollah is able to carry out hundreds of operations against Israel, remember Israel went to war against Hezbollah in 2006 over the killing, I think, of three and the kidnapping or the capturing of two soldiers, right? And until now, they are still banging the table, says an all-out war. We are going to burn Lebanon, so forth and so on. Yet they can't do anything. These are all signs that the client regimes, if you will, of the Middle East are no longer powerful, because their sponsor, the United States, no longer controls all the cards. Will the Chinese, and I think the answer is yes before I even ask the question, will the Chinese find in this an opportunity to kind of find spaces and margins within the existing political map of the Middle East to pose as the new sponsor, new mediator? Yes, I do think so. And we have evidence to that, not just the Palestinian agreement, the Beijing Declaration on July 23rd, but also because of the Iran Saudi agreement, a major agreement that held, by the way, which is very, very important, and also because of the outcome of the American invasion of Iraq. When the Americans invaded Iraq, we were told, of course, they have their own logic that we never believe about democracy and human rights. Of course, I mean, how can you speak about human rights in Iraq and you are cheering for the extermination of the Palestinians in Gaza? So that can't possibly be the reason. Neither human rights nor democracy have anything to do with what happened in Iraq. But people with a little bit of common sense understood that the Americans are in Iraq not necessarily because of the oil itself, but because of the strategic and the geostrategic value of having total control over the natural resources of Iraq and naturally the rest
Mm.
of the Middle East. But right now, the biggest trading partner with Iraq is China, not the United States. And as the Americans came and built all these military bases across the country, the Chinese, a couple of years ago, signed an agreement with the Iraqi government to build 1,000 schools. Now, this is geopolitics, but using kind of soft power as opposed to hard power. The argument back then was no, 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 this is not, and this is what American mainstream media argued, that this is not the Chinese trying to become an important player in the Middle East. They are just buying leverage in order for them to have, to extend their trading partners and relationships. But now we are beginning to see China using very strongly worded political language. They started in the South China Sea region, the Pacific region, and now they are extending that language to the Middle East as well. I think this is a process in its very early steps. Various variables would have to work in favor of that Chinese foreign policy in order for this to happen. And the most important variable, the outcome of the Gaza war. If the Gaza war ended up uh, with an outcome in which Palestinians can at least claim that we have succeeded in defeating Israel's original objectives in Gaza, and the Palestinians are a power to be contended with. If that happens, then China will have a strong reason to
Mm.
play even a bigger role in the Middle East because they will have some content and material to work with.
What are the chances of this happening?
Well, the chances of this happening, Henry Kissinger had that interesting saying that in when a traditional army fights a guerrilla group, if it doesn't win, it loses, right? And he's right. Kissinger is right. So if Israel doesn't achieve kind of push the reset button on Palestine, and what do I mean by the reset button?
Mm.
The reset button is Gaza is under siege again. Just taken for granted that God willing, there will be no ethnic cleansing out of Gaza and that sort of thing. If they push the reset button, and that is going back to the years of the siege, mowing the grass, as in going in whenever we want to, killing whomever we want to at any time of our choosing. And there is a siege on Gaza, and poor Palestinians are suffering, and the deterrence has been established or re-established. Maybe it will take a little bit more than the Gaza war. Maybe they have to go to the West Bank, destroy several refugee camps, especially in the northern West Bank, and kind of like redeem themselves slowly and go back to the early position. Well, in that case, Israel would have won. I doubt that is going to happen. We don't really have any strong reason to believe that Israel, under any circumstance, would be able to achieve this. So the military analysts and the strategic analysts as well, who say that the outcome of the war has been determined from the very start, they are right. But Israel is like a sore loser that is just going through this momentum, this ongoing war targeting children. I mean, decapitated children. I saw the newsletter of the Palestine deep dive today, where the title spoke about the decapitated children of Khan Yunis. How is the decapitation of children in Khan Yunis will change the outcome of the war? And I mean the outcome in terms of exposing the vulnerabilities of the Israeli army. Per the words of former Israeli military general, who said that Israel has managed to control the Gaza brigade, or the Gaza, the Israeli command in the Gaza envelope, in less than 1 hour, to redeem the security or the massive insecurity underway in Gaza, restore the old military and political balances, restore the Israeli people's perception of their state. How is this going to happen? I don't really think of any possible scenario for this to
But
actually take
some
place.
people argue that Israel is already winning because the actual objectives of the war from Israel is not just to destroy Hamas or bring back the hostages, but actually the total destruction of the Palestinian people, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, or killing as many Palestinians as possible, destroying the infrastructure of Gaza. And they're already doing that. They have killed so many people. They have destroyed the infrastructure of Gaza, all of the infrastructure in Gaza. So maybe they're actually winning. It's not just about Hamas and destroying the military capabilities of Hamas. What do you say?
I know that I know this may sound controversial, but even in the language of this vengeful, angry, racist, utterly inhumane language of the likes of Bingvir, Eliyahu, Smotrich, even Galant, and all others, killing is in itself not an actual strategy in war. You kill in order for you to achieve ultimately some sort of an objective. Like, for example, the killing that happened during the Nakba. If you look at all the massacres that were carried out against the Palestinian people in the Nakba, south, north, east, and west, they've always had an ultimate strategic objective: instilling fear in the heart of the Palestinians, making the Palestinians feel so helpless, so dominated, that no amount of resistance, no amount of smooth steadfastness will ever be able to change this imminent outcome, that Israel, the Jewish state, is here to stay, and Palestinians will eventually be, ethnically cleansed. And sadly, it worked. Not because Palestinians were cowardly, because the situation back then was so complex. They had no tools to fight with. They really had very little support coming from the outside world. There were no communication channels by the Palestinians. It's like they were knocked on their heads repeatedly without understanding what was befalling them. And Ahmed, as much as I do, we sons of refugees understand how that generation of Palestinians perceived the entire process of the Nakba. They thought it is a temporary setback, that the refugees will come back in no time. And I always repeat the story about the new blankets, where, like, my grandfather would not take the new blankets with him in the journey of the Nakba, because he thought we are not going to destroy them and make them all dusty and ruined in the journey. Let's leave the new blankets at home in order for us to come back in the matter of few days or weeks.
Hmm.
Of course, they never did, and that generation died out in Gaza and refugee camps and in the Shatat outside. This time is different because the Israelis are using the same tactic, but at a much more intense state because they know that they are not fighting an easy enemy. But the hope that the Israelis have is that by killing so many Palestinians, they will eventually force them out. Now that didn't happen. It's not going to happen. I want to believe it's not going to happen because if the Palestinians are out of Palestine, that indeed would be, from the brutal logic of Israel, would be considered a victory. Killing in itself is not going to change the outcomes because we Palestinians are stubborn, very stubborn, and very entitled people. In the sense, I know it sounds controversial, but entitled in the sense that we do not accept to live in, as we say in Arabic, in mahana, in humiliation. We can't accept it. We are equal. We want to be treated fairly and justly. We want to be equal to everybody else. We want to have the right to live, to travel, to breathe, to receive medical care, to go to our universities. No amount of indoctrination, victimization, humiliation of the Palestinians had changed that collective mindset that we are equal to everybody else. Everything that Israel has done to shock the Palestinian collective psyche into submission and humiliation and changing the expectations and the standards of what we actually want, they all have failed. If they continue to fail, and inshallah they will continue to fail, Israel cannot achieve any kind of victory in Gaza. One last thing. I went to Gaza in 2012, and I was expected 2008, 2009. There was a major war, so-called Cast-led, and and numerous bombings in between, and then the war of 2012. I expected that Gaza is going to be in complete ruins. I couldn't see a single building that was in ruin. And I didn't understand. How is that possible? The Israelis were still not allowing cement into Gaza. How did the Palestinians rebuild Gaza? And what I didn't realize is that they were taking the cement of the destroyed building, crushing it, and rebuilding the buildings, even in some states, in even better and stronger and more beautiful than before. I know it sounds sentimental, especially during times of genocide, but the Palestinians have that capability to resurrect themselves again and again. We are one of the most educated nations in the Middle East, despite the fact that we went through major wars, ethnic cleansings, living under apartheid, living under siege, living under constant state of violence. Yet somehow we resurrected ourselves, and we are some of the most educated of people. How is that possible? There's something about the Palestinians as a people that cannot be blown up. No amount of firepower can change that. But what I am hoping for is that the various leaderships that claim to represent the Palestinians can mature enough to understand that this is a historic moment that might never ever be repeated. And our personal interest, our need for prestige and titles and false power and positions and shares and all the rest is extremely marginal compared to what this moment demands of us. Our unity right now is critical because no one, not China, not Russia, not even the United States, would ever take us serious if we remain divided.
But the Palestinian factions seem to be historically divided. What has it changed now? Why did they go to Beijing? And what incentives do the two major political parties, Fatah and Hamas, have to sign this declaration right now?
First, regarding why have we been historically divided? Um,
Or are we
Unfortunately,
have we
yes,
been
yes,
historically divided?
yes, we are historically divided. Not the people, the faction, and that's another misnomer that is often seen. Like why Palestinians are divided, and I would say, hold on for a second here. If you are talking about the Palestinian people, we're not divided. If you're talking about the Palestinian leaderships or factions, they are divided. And there is a reason for that. First of all, why we Palestinians are. I don't know, let's say that you come from a different ideology or you have none. and I come from a different ideology, or I have none. Um, but when we watch what's happening in Gaza, our rage, our anger, our frustration is the same. When we look at what's happening in Jenin and Tulkarem, we feel the same way. When we take a position regarding the right of return for Palestinian refugees, regarding our right to resist, regarding all of these things, we have the same position. We are united in the sense that we know who we are, we know what we come from, we have more or less similar political aspirations. We are part of the collective experience of the Palestinians. In my opinion, from a popular point of view, that's unity. Why is that unity not translating to that of factions? Because historically, Palestine has been, from a foreign policy viewpoint, Palestine has been leased to other Arab countries. Libya had a Palestinian faction working for the Libyans. The Syrians had their own political factions. The Iraqis even had the same thing. And of course, Egypt, Jordan, and others had their own allies and their own enemies. And with time, you do this over the course of generations, then you kind of end up aligning your position to that of your host country. And as a result, these factions ultimately ended up serving the interests of the various Arab host countries.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like if Oslo was of any benefit, and it really wasn't of much benefit, but if it was of any benefit, it maybe re-centralized and recalibrated the relationship between the Palestinian and Palestine. So you have those who resist and those who don't, those who fight back and those who don't. But all of this is happening largely within Palestinian political space, right? So that's where really the history of factionalism and all of that. My hope, again, once more, is that we are beginning to understand that Israel's war is not a war on Hamas. There was a famous Arab network that comes in the English language in the Middle East, no need to name names. For the longest time, they had, and I don't know if they still have it or not, a live blog that was shaped under the title The Israel Hamas War. And you can't imagine how offensive this is to Palestinians who know that those who are being killed in Gaza, and many of those who are fighting in Gaza, are not Hamas. And many of them belong actually to Fatah, and many of them belong to the socialist and other Islamic groups. This is the war on the Palestinian people. When Palestinians were declared human animals, from Galan's point of view, he didn't say Hamas were human animals. He didn't say Islamic Jihad, but the others are really good, cool guys. They would say Palestinians are, Gazans are human animals. That's the perception in Israel's side. Will our factions understand that they are being as demonized and as targeted as everybody else? No one is going to survive this. And a very important book, I mean, if we lose, nobody is going to survive this, and inshallah we won't. Very important book, as you all know, the seminal book of Ilan Pappé, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He speaks about the various Mukhtars, the
Mm.
heads of the clans in Palestine prior to 1948. When they saw the fate of many of the villages that resisted, they were burned to the ground. There were many of their people were killed, and the rest were ethnically cleansed. Some of the Mukhtars thought that they were being clever, so they thought, let's try to make a side deal with the Israelis, with the militias, the Haganah, and all the rest. We're not gonna fight you, so you have no reason to burn our villages and ethnically cleanse our people. Well, you know what? Israel did exactly that, even to the Mukhtars and to the villages that did not resist. Because their hatred for Palestinians and Arabs, it was not individualized hatred for a specific village or a clan or a political group. The same thing that applied to the Nakba. Actually, according to Ilan, some of these villages had worse fate than those who resisted. And what applied to the Nakba then, that Nakba back then applies to this Nakba right now. So it's either we put our act together or we are going to all fall together.
And how do you think it is likely that this reconciliation will succeed? Is it just a public relation exercise, or is it serious and genuine?
Each party has keen interest in making it a success. And when I'm referring to each party, I'm honestly talking about Hamas and Fatah. I'm not saying that the others are not important. Every Palestinian is entitled to having a political stance, even an ideology, and everyone who resists Israel in whatever form or shape should be admired for his or her struggle, regardless of the composition or the number of the group or the faction. But ultimately, it's about Hamas and Fatah, because if Hamas and Fatah are actually able to find middle ground for long-term reconciliation, no one else is going to defy that. All the minor groups will have to actually play along. Hamas has every reason to do so, because if indeed the way out from a political point of view of the Gaza war is for Hamas to say, listen, I'm not interested in ruling Gaza, and I am open to a Palestinian unity government, even a bureaucratic, like a government of bureaucrats, to, in the intermediate, period to rule over Gaza, and then we can do elections and all of that. I am happy with that, and it makes sense because I think Hamas's ultimate goal is to create something similar to what's happening in Lebanon, the relationship between Hezbollah and the Lebanese government. I do the resistance. Maybe I get involved at a local level in terms of elections, but I'm going to leave the leadership and the president to do their thing. And strategically is not entirely not accurate. From Fatah's point of view, the Palestinian Authority, namely, they have reached a conclusion that Israel does not see a future for the Palestinian Authority in Gaza or in the West. And I think that's even more important because you can't talk about annexation of the West Bank. You can't talk about expanding settlements in the West Bank. You can't talk about a completely new type of relationship between Israel and the West Bank and maintain the Palestinian Authority in its current format. They would have to change that format. Number two, there has been kind of talks leaked through various papers in the US that some Arab countries, namely the United Arab Emirates, is working with the United States and Israel to create an alternative leadership that is neither Hamas nor Fatah in Gaza.
Dahlan.
Yes, exactly. Right. So you have and this is the Palestinian Authority knows well that this is true, and if indeed that is the objective, then again, if that model succeeds in Gaza, it will succeed most likely in the West Bank because the West Bank is even more vulnerable than Gaza, right? So I am worried though that if Israel is not able to change the outcomes. I'm not worried about that. They will not be able to change the outcomes of Gaza, but they might eventually lean back to the American idea that why don't you give the Palestinian Authority a chance in Gaza? And if they do, then the Beijing Declaration will serve no purpose. The
Yes, but
message to the American will not be delivered and will go back to the way things were.
but why would the PA reconcile with Hamas since Hamas is proscribed in the West as a terror organization? And then reconciling with Hamas or having Hamas in the government or in power with the PA might endanger all of the work that the PA has been doing over the past 30 years, aligning itself with international law, appealing to the West. So, putting itself with Hamas in the same table might endanger or jeopardize what they have been working on for the past 30 years.
Right. I'm not really sure what the Palestinian Authority has done in the last 30 years in terms of actually achieving anything tangible. But let's just go with the logic of the Palestinian Authority itself, that we have indeed, been building this pro-Palestine movement that is centered around international priorities and international law, and the recognition of Palestine has increased exponentially in the last few years, especially in the last 10 months, and we don't want to go back to sanction them because they have Hamas. I think there are ways out of it, and I think possibly the best way out of it is to have a non-allied um, government that neither represents the interests of Fatah or Hamas, but rather the interests of the Palestinian people. And the interests of the Palestinian people right now in Gaza would be to rebuild Gaza, to allow for to establish political unity between the West Bank and Gaza, administrative unity between putting the Palestinian political body or body politic rather as a whole. I mean, recreating it so that we can actually truly start feeling that we all belong to one single leadership. What will happen after that is something that will have to be left to the Palestinian people, and I'm namely talking about elections. Those who are running in these elections do not necessarily have to run under the banner of Fatah and Hamas. I mean, as you know, I mean, half of Gaza is either this party or that party. It doesn't mean that you are a member of that party. Sometimes you have entire clans. You say this clan belongs to Fatah, this clan belongs to Hamas. It doesn't mean that they are all active members in Fatah or Hamas. So you could actually establish some kind of a political structure that is loosely affiliated with the various ideologies, but without having direct affiliation, that could be used by anyone as a way to impose any sort of pressure or sanctions on the Palestinian leadership.
Well, you have mentioned that there are rumors that coming out from the US and the UAE and Israel that they might put Mohammed Dahlan and his supporters to manage the post-war of Gaza. Can you tell us a little bit about who Mohammed Dahlan is and what do you make of these rumors?
Right. Well, Mohammed Dahlan, until very recently, was really not an important character in Palestinian politics. Um, I think he reached the heyday of Mohammed Dahlan was just prior to the Fatah Hamas clash in Gaza in the summer of 2007. By then, he was the kind of the it depends on how you want to see it. You could see he was a warlord, or he was the top security man, managing 10 different security branches belonging to the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. He was one of the top leaders of Fatah, and he was influential within the Fatah grouping beyond Gaza as well. After the Hamas managed to rule Gaza, separate from Fatah, and the end of the Fatah reign of Gaza, Mohammed Dahlan moves to the West Bank, and he tries to play a political role there. But here's the problem. It was way out of it was not his domain at all. So naturally a clash had to happen. And the clash was directly between Mohammed Dahlan and Mahmoud Abbas. Mohammed Dahlan lost and he left the country, and he was expelled from Fatah, expelled from all the various PLO organizations that were controlled by his rival, Mahmoud Abbas. But he remained an asset for the various Arab countries that are trying to have leverage over the Palestinians. Thus, he went to the United Arab Emirates, and an asset to the United States, even an asset to other European countries. So he became kind of shopping for allies. You kind of see him involved in sports one day, involved in politics the other day, involved in Libya the third day, in Lebanon the fourth, and so forth. But with time, he became more and more irrelevant until the Gaza war started, and suddenly Mohammed Dahlan is making appearances on sympathetic media to Mohammed Dahlan and his cause. And this is why Mohammed Dahlan's name is once again being floated back into the stream of political discourses regarding Gaza. Um, I don't know exactly if Hamas itself has pondered the possibility of having Mohammed Dahlan come back to Gaza as a way to say, hey, we are not the ones in charge, so you really have no reason anymore to carry on with this war in the name of destroying Hamas. But I think the one who feels a greater threat from Mohammed Dahlan is not Hamas, because they hold all the cards in Gaza, but rather the Palestinian Authority. And I do believe that indeed the Beijing Declaration had something to do with the fear that Israel is looking for a replacement of Mahmoud Abbas and his Palestinian Authority. Whether that replacement is Mohammed Dahlan or any others is not so important. What really is important, it seems that they want to move past that whole chapter of Mahmoud Abbas and the International Criminal Court and the ICJ and all of that. They want a whole different ball game as far as the relationship with, in the words of Netanyahu in the Congress, as you mentioned earlier in the program, when Netanyahu gave his speech, he said, "We want to work with Palestinians who do not hate Israel." We Palestinians, refer to this as Palestinian collaborators who would collaborate with Israel unconditionally. That's what Netanyahu's work is looking for.
Given all what we have talked about now, Dr. Ramzi, in terms of geopolitics and the Palestinian factions, what role do activists play right now, and what should they be doing? Activists in Palestine or outside Palestine, or mainly in the UK and the US, the West.
Right, right. So um, Israel will be defeated because, in the words of Richard Falk, those who win the legitimacy war will always win the liberation war. And the Palestinians were winning the legitimacy war years before the Gaza genocide started. Now the Gaza genocide has further cemented the Palestinian victory over the legitimacy war. Now we need to translate that legitimacy war victory into actual tangible victory on the ground, right? Palestinians are doing their part and more. As far as the Palestinian people, you hear people say things like, I am proud to be of this nationality or that nationality. Not only we are proud to be Palestinians, we are proud to be Gazans, but I feel like we have to work so very hard to actually earn that pride, because these people took us to a whole new level of courage, bravery, communality, in ways that I feel it takes much more than a declaration that we are proud Palestinians to be a Palestinian. So I think the Palestinian people themselves are doing their part and more. Our discussion today focused on, will the Palestinian factions match that? I hope they do. I hope they read the situation right for their own sake, and they do. Another layer of support, and it's a very important layer, is international solidarity. To talk about solidarity to unpack what that means and what it entails, that requires a whole separate conversation. But I will just demonstrate to you very easily why solidarity has been consequential for this particular time. If you remove global solidarity with Palestine, if you delete any post on Palestine on social media, if you marginalize the millions upon millions of people who protested for Palestine all across the world, and you just lift this monstrous Israeli military machine having a go at defenseless innocent children and women in Gaza, and nobody is talking about it. Nobody is, it's not even part of the everyday reality or realization. We Palestinians would have lost the war.
Yeah.
Solidarity has been so critical to the Palestinian collective psyche, but the pressures that are being put on Israel. If Israel did not have any pressure, I think if Palestinians would have been in Sinai months ago. Pressure has been critical. It doesn't mean that solidarity can replace Palestinian resistance, not in the least, not in the least. But without solidarity, I think the Palestinian cause would have been a marginal cause and would have given the space to Israel and the United States and their Western partners in the UK, Germany, France, and elsewhere to do as they pleased with the Palestinian people. So we need to keep the pressure on our governments. We need to keep the conversations on Palestine. We need to be angry because it really calls for it. If the decapitation of babies and the extermination of 10% of a population does not call for anger and radical thinking on Palestine, when will we ever be angry? When will we ever be radical? So we need to keep that pressure, but with the understanding that we are not here to replace Palestinians. It is their homeland, it's their struggle, it's their sacrifices, and it's their resistance that will ultimately make all the difference.
Dr. Ramzy Baroud, thank you very, very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Ahmed. Thank you.